The boy came in holding his elbow, not crying, and Poppy Pomfrey had learned long ago that the ones who weren't crying were either fine or in considerably more trouble than they thought. This one was fine. She confirmed it within the first 2 minutes, running the examination she'd given every Quidditch casualty to pass through this ward for more than 20 years. Skull first, then spine. The soft tissue at the back of the neck, where a thrown rider most often absorbed the impact, the major joints, the circulation check at both wrists. Nothing broken. The broom had thrown him. He'd said so, in the clipped way of a child who wasn't sure what to admit to, but not far enough and not hard enough for the damage she'd been cataloguing in her head in the 2 seconds between seeing him in the doorway and getting her hands on him. She had been at this long enough to know the difference between the shock of pain and the shock of having survived something. What sat in Harry Potter's face as she worked was the second. She'd been careful since September not to think too closely about Harry Potter. He was small. Some children were small. He was thin, not lean the way natural seekers could be lean, the position favoring lighter frames, but thin in a more persistent, specific way that she recognized and had been choosing not to name. Some children were thin. She'd made herself note it and continue, because it was not her place to speculate about students on the basis of build, and she had a long career, and she knew her own province from everyone else's. Healers healed. The rest of it belonged to someone else. She ran through the routine. The routine gave her hands somewhere to be. "Any nausea?" she asked, not looking at him. "How is your vision? Has anything tingled or gone numb?" He answered in the careful way he answered everything. No, fine." She had catalogued enough patients to recognize the kind of child who defaulted to fine on principle. "Are you eating well? At school, I mean." That was a deviation from routine, and something registered in his face, even though his expression didn't move. "Yes," he said. "The food here's brilliant. And before term, mealtimes at home. Were they regular?" She was still writing. She kept her voice the way she kept everything in this ward. Level, brisk, apparently already on to the next thing. The pause was small. She had been counting small pauses for 20 years. "We had dinner," he said, and then into the quiet she held open for him. "Sometimes I missed it. But school's much better." She made a brief note. He wasn't injured. She discharged him with the standard advisory. 2 days' rest from broomstick flying, delivered in the tone that indicated guidance rather than instruction, which every Quidditch patient in her experience correctly interpreted as optional. He thanked her with the economy of someone who had learned to be grateful efficiently and leave before anything further was required of him. She watched him pull on his outer robe, slight shoulders, the robe a size too large even for a first year, the round glasses sitting slightly crooked on his thin face. She noticed the scar above his fringe, the way she always did, the way she always had since September. Lightning bolt-shaped, faded but permanent, sitting there above those green eyes, like a line at the bottom of a page. His friends came for him before he'd entirely finished. The tall Weasley boy and the Granger girl, both of whom had plainly been waiting in the corridor, and were restraining themselves from running only by an effort of will. The ward door opened and brought noise with it. Relief, celebration, someone having won something they hadn't been certain they would win. The boy was different immediately. Lighter. He laughed at something the Weasley said, and the laugh opened his face in a way that startled her faintly, because she had not seen it move like that during the examination. Had not, she realized, seen it move quite like that at all in the 2 months he'd been at Hogwarts. He let himself be steered toward the corridor. He looked back once at the doorway, reflexively, and then the 3 of them were gone, Poppy Pomfrey stood in the empty ward and listened to the corridor settle into quiet. She had a professional code, and she had held to it for a long time. She treated what came through her door. She did not ask how injuries happened, because she'd learned early in her career that asking rarely changed what needed to be done, and occasionally prevented it. She did not speculate or interfere, or carry the business of one patient into another's. These were professional values, and they had served her well, and she crossed the ward and opened the filing cabinet in the corner. It wasn't a decision. Her hands were simply there before she was. She knew where everything was. She'd arranged it herself, and maintained it herself, the way she maintained everything in this ward, because when something went wrong at 2 a.m, there was no time to search. The alphabetical dividers, the older folders towards the back of each section, grown a little stiff with age. James Potter's file was thin, the way her files always were. She'd never seen the point in unnecessary language. It smelled of the cedar blocks she replaced every October. She carried it to the desk by the lamp and set it beside Harry's. James Harold Potter, age 11, September 1971. First year, Gryffindor. She'd written the intake entry herself, as she'd written all of them, in the compressed hand she'd had since her training, and never quite lost. Height and weight, above average. General assessment, excellent. No anomalies noted. She could remember him now, looking at her own words. She remembered all her Quidditch players most clearly, because they came back year after year for the same inventive varieties of damage, and she'd had James Potter for 6 seasons of it. Dark hair that went in all directions, hazel eyes with an awareness of the room, the quality of someone who moved through a room before he'd spoken, the ease of someone who had always had enough. Enough food, enough space, enough of everything that accumulated quietly over years into a child who moved through the world without bracing for it. He'd been healthy in the fullest sense, not merely free of illness, but visibly tended, well-fed, well-clothed. Arrived at Hogwarts with the particular assurance of a boy whose home had always been warm. She looked at what she'd written in Harry Potter's file that afternoon. She looked at it for some time. The difference was not small. That was the thing she kept coming back to as the lamplights lowered on their slow evening schedule. She had been telling herself since September that it was within the ordinary range, the natural variation among growing children, and the 2 files sitting side by side in front of her made that position unavailable. They carried the same dark hair and the same angle of jaw, and they were not the product of the same kind of childhood. The numbers in front of her were not imprecision or interpretation. They were the numbers of 2 different histories, and one of those histories was not what a child's history was supposed to be. She drank none of her tea. She read both files in full, and then sat with her hands flat on the desk, and made herself be honest. She had treated this boy's father for 7 years. She had watched James Potter at 11 become James Potter at 17. She had, she acknowledged now, looked at Harry Potter in September, and not wanted to know what she knew because her professional code had made not knowing very comfortable. Her code was starting to look like something else. She found a clean sheet of parchment and wrote carefully, without hurrying. Harry Potter's measurements, dated that afternoon. James Potter's, September 1971. The differential between them, in exact terms, without the softening language she might have reached for if she'd been trying to make the note easy to dismiss. She included Harry's answer about mealtimes. She wrote it the way she wrote everything in this ward, accurately, because accuracy was the only version of kindness that remained available to her here. When she was done, she folded the parchment into Harry's file and put both files in her bag. She straightened the desk. She extinguished the lamp. Tomorrow morning, before breakfast, before the corridors filled with children, she would go up to the headmaster's office. She would go as a medical professional with a documented professional concern, and she would present what she had found, and the headmaster would determine what to do with it. That was the appropriate channel. She had spent a long career trusting appropriate channels. She had a feeling, she, who was not a person given to feelings, that tomorrow was going to ask her a question about that. Poppy Pomfrey went to bed at 10, as she always did. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling of her quarters for rather longer than usual before sleep came. The stone gargoyle stepped aside for her, without being given the password, which told her something she had not expected to know this early in the morning. The staircase carried her upward in a slow spiral, and Poppy Pomfrey stood on it, with her bag held in both hands and her chin level, the way she stood in the ward when something was going to be unpleasant and she had already decided to go through with it regardless. She had been awake since 4. She had written and rewritten the sequence in her head, while the sky outside her window went from black to the dark blue of very early winter, and she had arrived at the same sequence each time, which she took as confirmation that it was the right one. The staircase reached its top. The door showed warm light at its base. She knocked. "Come in, Poppy." She had not announced herself on the stairs. The office was as she had seen it twice before in her career, on occasions 20 years apart and similarly significant. The silver instruments whirring on their small tables, each measuring something she did not have the expertise to name. The former headmasters in their frames along the walls, several of them awake and watching with the alert attention of portraits that recognized a moment worth observing. The sorting hat sat on its shelf. The sword of Gryffindor caught what light there was from the window, and Fawkes was on his perch, scarlet and gold, very still, regarding her with the uncanny equanimity of a creature that had watched more moments than she had years, and had concluded that none of them were entirely new. Albus Dumbledore was behind his desk. He wore his robes rather than anything that suggested he had slept, and his half-moon spectacles were in place, and his long silver beard was arranged with its habitual imprecision across his front, and she had the impression that she could have arrived 6 hours ago or 6 hours hence and found him in precisely the same condition. He rose when she came in. He was very tall. That was the thing she always forgot between visits. That he was, in person, surprisingly tall. "Tea?" he said. "No," she said. She set her bag on the chair in front of his desk and produced both files and placed them between them on the polished surface. James Harold Potter. Harry James Potter. She had labelled them in her clearest hand this morning, the hand she used when documents needed to be legible to people other than herself. Dumbledore looked at the files and then looked at her. He sat. She explained. She was precise and brief, and she did not speculate or attribute. She covered Harry's measurements and their deviation from the expected range for a child of his age and build. She covered James Potter's 1971 intake data and what it represented as a baseline. She showed him the comparative notes she had written the night before, annotated with the relevant reference ranges in the smaller handwriting she used for marginalia. She did not raise her voice. She did not invite interruption. She presented what the files contained, and she allowed the files to do the speaking, because the files, she had concluded, were the most persuasive thing in the room. She could see, as she spoke, that Dumbledore was not going to dispute it. He listened with his hands folded on the desk, and his attention complete, the quality of attention she associated with people who already know something important is coming and are deciding how to receive it. She found this simultaneously easier and harder than she had expected. When she finished, he said, "Thank you for bringing this to me, Poppy." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "May I explain?" It was not phrased as a question. He told her about the blood protection charm. He explained it fully, in the manner of a man who had thought about something for a long time and had decided the full account was the honest one. He told her that Lily Potter's sacrifice, at the moment of her death on the 31st of October, 1981, had created a protection around Harry more powerful than any deliberate enchantment, that it was anchored in her love, that it would remain active as long as Harry could call his mother's blood family home, as long as he returned there at least once a year, that the charm would dissolve if that connection were severed, that he had, in the early hours of the 1st of November 1981, weighed this against every alternative he could identify, and had concluded that the protection the charm provided was the reason Harry Potter had survived what should have killed him, and the reason something far worse had not reached him since. He did not look away from her as he said this. She made herself observe him precisely, the quality that distinguished an honest explanation from a practiced one. And she could not, in honesty, determine which this was. The two were, in his case, very difficult to separate. He mentioned with more care and less detail that there was an additional consideration, a prophecy concerning Harry, concerning the eventual return of the force that had killed his parents. He did not quote it. He said only that it had been a factor in his thinking about why Harry's survival had to be the first and overriding concern, before comfort, before circumstance, before the ordinary calculations of where a child might be happiest. She let him speak. She was skilled at letting people speak. Then she said, "And did you know?" He regarded her over his spectacles. "What specifically are you asking, Poppy?" Again, not a question. "What it was actually like," she said. "Not in November 1981. After, year on year. What the boy's life in that house actually was." The pause was a particular kind. She had spent enough time in rooms with people in distress to have developed a thorough taxonomy of pauses. There were pauses that reached for words, pauses that flinched from them, and pauses that were deciding how much of the truth to let through. This was the third kind, and it ended the way those pauses always ended, with rather more truth than the speaker had intended. "I placed someone in the area," Dumbledore said. "A squib who lived nearby, who had legitimate reason to see Harry regularly. She was asked to observe and report. I received reports across 10 years. She waited. The reports indicated that he was present and not in obvious danger. I understood this as confirmation that the arrangement was functioning. "It may be," he said, and he said it with a steadiness that she found more troubling than any amount of distress would have been, that I was not sufficiently specific about what I required to be reported. Poppy Pomfrey looked at Albus Dumbledore and thought about the phrase, sufficiently specific. She thought about what it would mean to spend 10 years in a house that Harry Potter had come from, thin-wristed and careful, and thanking her in the voice of a child who had learned to thank people efficiently and leave before anything further was asked. She thought about the word insufficiently in the mouth of the most powerful wizard alive, applied to 10 years of a child's life. She collected the files from the desk, returned them to her bag, and closed the clasp. "I appreciate you seeing me," she said. "I need to think carefully about my professional obligations, given everything I've told you and everything you've told me. I'll be in touch." He rose. He was very tall. "Poppy," he said. One word. She could not have defined precisely what he meant by it, but she understood the shape of it. He was asking her not to mistake what she had heard for something other than the full account. He was asking her to believe that this was, genuinely, as much as he could say. "Good morning, Albus," she said, and she left. The door closed and Dumbledore stood at his desk in the silence his office made after a conversation worth remembering. He sat down after a moment, slowly. Outside the window the school was waking. He could hear it through the ancient walls, the distributed rustle of a large building coming alive, hundreds of children beginning an ordinary Tuesday in a castle that was, this morning, not entirely certain it deserved the word ordinary. He had spent a very long time learning to read people. He had learned to distinguish between someone who had heard an explanation and accepted it, someone who was still weighing it, and someone who had arrived in the room with the conclusion already made and stayed only to confirm she was right. Poppy Pomfrey had not come up those stairs to be persuaded. Fawkes made a low sound on his perch, not the full song, not the bright music he produced when something was about to be healed, but the quieter note, the one that emerged in the small hours when something had shifted that would not shift back. Dumbledore did not speak to him. He looked at the 2 files on his desk, which she had left without taking, and then looked at the window, and then sat very still while the light grew. Poppy Pomfrey's private sitting room was not a place Minerva McGonagall visited often. It occupied a small antechamber off the hospital wing, not the ward itself, but the room the matron used when she needed to speak to parents or to colleagues who required a conversation that the ward's open floor could not accommodate. It smelled of dried lavender and cedar and the faint medicinal undertone that clung to everything Pomfrey owned, and it contained 2 chairs and a small table and very little else, because Pomfrey was, in all things, a person who kept what she needed and set aside what she didn't. The note had arrived at 7 in the morning, in the 2-line handwriting Minerva associated with Pomfrey at her most focused. "Minerva, please come when you can. Hospital wing sitting room. Not urgent, but important." It was signed P. Minerva had come immediately, because a note from Poppy Pomfrey that said, "Not urgent, but important," was, in her experience, always important. The 2 files were on the table between them, before Pomfrey said a word about them. Minerva looked at the labels. She read the name on the top file, and then the name on the bottom one, and set her hands flat on her knees, and said nothing for a moment. "How long have you had these?" she said. "James's file has been in my cabinet since September 1971, Pomfrey said. "Harry's since September 1991. I put them together 2 nights ago. 2 nights ago, the night of the first Quidditch match of the term." Minerva opened the top file. She read the intake entry for James Harold Potter, age 11, September 1971. She had been 35 that autumn, a teacher of 7 years, already certain of her place and what it required. She remembered James Potter at 11, the way she remembered all her first years from the original distance, before they became specific. A name in the roll, a face at the sorting, a student she would know better later. He had been sorted into Gryffindor, and she had thought, not for the last time, that he would be a handful. Dark, untidy hair that clearly made its own decisions. The expression of a boy who had never had any reason to doubt that things were going to go well for him, because they always had. She put James's file down and picked up Harry's. She read it the way she read Transfiguration examination papers when she suspected something had gone wrong, with the careful, unreceptive attention of someone who was hoping to find a different answer than the one the text kept insisting on. She read it once, and then she read the comparative notes Pomfrey had written in the smaller handwriting she used for marginalia, and she read those twice. When she set it down very carefully. "I went to Dumbledore this morning," Pomfrey said, "before breakfast. he received me. And he explained the blood protection charm in full. He mentioned a prophecy, without detail, only that it existed and was relevant. He told me about the surveillance arrangement he had in place. A pause. The quiet, particular quality Pomfrey's pauses had when she was measuring something. He acknowledged he may have been insufficiently specific about what he asked his observer to report. Minerva looked at the table. She had been on Privet Drive. She had spent 11 hours there on the 1st of November 1981, in her cat form, on the cold garden wall across the street, watching number 4 with the systematic attention she brought to assessments. She had watched Vernon Dursley leave in the morning and return in the evening. She had watched Petunia Dursley in the garden and at the window, and she had watched the way the house was arranged. The neatness of it, the particular neatness of a home that was obsessively attended to rather than warmly lived in, and she had formed a view. At midnight, when Dumbledore arrived, she had told him. She had not, as a rule, been indirect with colleagues she respected, and she had not been indirect with Dumbledore then. She had told him that the Dursleys were the wrong people, that you could not have found 2 people who were less like the world Harry would need to be prepared for, that the idea of placing this child in this house was something she could not account for, that she had seen Petunia Dursley's face, and it had not been the face of a woman who would be glad to receive this particular knock on the door. He had heard all of it. He had not disagreed. He had explained the charm, and then the necessity. And then he had looked at her, over his spectacles, in the way that meant a decision had already been made. She had been one colleague disagreeing with another, and the colleague she disagreed with was Albus Dumbledore. And in that situation, in November 1981, there had been no structure available for the disagreement to travel through. It went nowhere. She had carried it, without exactly choosing to, for 10 years. McGonagall was not a woman given to weeping. She had wept once, briefly and privately, the night she heard James and Lily were dead, and she did not speak of it, and she did not think of it as something she would need to do again. What happened now, reading Harry Potter's file in Poppy Pomfrey's sitting room, was not that. It was quieter, and in some ways worse. A stillness that came from the inside and settled into something harder, the way certain materials behaved under prolonged cold. 10 years. She had carried a private disagreement for 10 years, and the boy had carried something considerably heavier, and it had not occurred to her until this moment, with the file in front of her, the numbers on Pomfrey's annotated pages, the gap between what James Potter had weighed in September 1971 and what Harry Potter weighed now, that her private disagreement and the boy's experience were not 2 separate things. They were the same thing, seen from 2 different ends. "What are you intending to do?" she said. Pomfrey's hands were folded in her lap. She had the settled look she wore when a decision was already behind her, and she was merely explaining it. "I intend to file a formal report with the Board of Governors. Not because I think Dumbledore is a wicked man. I don't. But he knew Minerva. He had someone watching for 10 years, and the most recent report he received noted that Harry left for Hogwarts in September, thin for his age. It was in a written report, and nothing was done. I can't manage what I know within my own professional discretion. The board has authority that I don't have, and I believe they need to exercise it." Minerva was quiet. She thought about 1981, and the wall outside number 4, and the particular expression on Petunia Dursley's face as she came out to sweep her front step. She thought about what it had meant to have an objection and nowhere for it to go. "I'll come with you," she said. 3 words. Pomfrey looked at her with an expression that was not precisely surprise. more the look of someone who had allowed themselves to hope for something, and was now watching the hope confirmed. Minerva met her eyes, and didn't elaborate, because she was not a person who said things twice when once was sufficient. She gathered herself and stood. There was a great deal to arrange. The Gryffindor common room was warm and firelit, and smelled of the particular indoor cold-weather combination of wool and wood smoke that Harry had come to think of, somewhere below the level of conscious recognition, as what safety smelled like. He was at the table in the far corner with Ron, who had his charms essay spread in front of him, and was writing with the resigned industriousness of someone who had calculated that finishing by midnight was still achievable if he didn't stop to think too hard about any individual sentence. Harry was helping, which meant Ron read sentences aloud, and Harry told him whether they made sense, a system that satisfied both of them despite having no serious academic foundation. Harry Potter was 11 years old. He did not know that 2 women had sat that morning in a room 2 floors below, with his medical file on a table between them. He did not know that one of them had just said 3 words that were going to rearrange the particular shape of the rest of his year, and possibly a good deal more. He was aware, in the general low-level way, of a child who has always paid quiet attention to the temperature of rooms, that Hogwarts was carrying some kind of tension this November that he couldn't quite locate or name. Teachers looked at each other. Certain conversations stopped when students came near. He had noticed, and he had filed it under things that were not his business, which was a long list, because he had always assumed most things were not his business. He did not think it was about him. He bent back over Ron's essay and pointed out a spelling error, and Ron groaned in the way that meant genuine frustration and contentment at the same time, and the fire crackled, and outside the high windows of Gryffindor Tower, the November sky was the flat white of clouds, with something in them they hadn't decided to do yet. The formal meeting chamber Hogwarts used for board proceedings was a room on the 2nd floor that McGonagall had identified for the purpose, and Pomfrey had not been in it before, which told her something about how infrequently the school had required one. It was long and stone-floored with high, narrow windows that admitted a grey November morning in thin columns of light. The table was too large to have arrived there through the existing doorways, and must have been conjured specifically, which gave the room the slightly improvised quality of a space that had not expected to be used for this. 8 chairs on one side, 4 on the other, a single chair at the head. Someone had placed water and glasses at intervals along the table's length, which struck Pomfrey as oddly domestic for the occasion, and then she thought, "No, it isn't. This is going to take a long time. The water is not domestic. It is practical." She had been there since 8 in the morning. It was now nearly 10. 7 days had passed since she and McGonagall had made their decision. 7 days in which she had written and submitted the formal report, received written confirmation of receipt, and then done what she always did when a matter was outside her control. She had returned to work. Ward rounds, a 3rd year's sprained wrist from Broom Club, a 1st year's spectacular collision with a suit of armour near the moving staircase, which had required patience, and 2 different counter-jinxes. The ongoing background frequency of minor complaints that constituted the acoustics of a building full of children in the grey stretch of November. She had done all of this with the focused efficiency of someone keeping their hands occupied, because the alternative was to sit still and think about what she had set in motion, and she was not at present able to think clearly about that without the particular sensation of looking over a ledge. She had looked over it. She had set something in motion. Those were facts, and she was a person who dealt with facts. The governors arrived between 9:15 and 9:50, in 1s and 2s, with the careful, deliberate manner of people who had come a considerable distance and understood the weight of what they were arriving for. 12 witches and wizards, none of whom Pomfrey knew well, and some of whom she had never encountered before today. They were dressed formally, dark robes, a family crest here and there at the collar or cuff, and they came in with the collective gravity of people who had governance experience and knew how to be solemn without appearing theatrical about it. They found their seats. They reviewed the parchments already set at their places. They did not, for the most part, speak to one another very much. The woman who appeared to be the most senior took the chair at the head of the table without needing to be directed to it. Grey-haired, broad-shouldered, with a quality of undramatic authority that Pomfrey recognized and respected. She opened a leather folio in front of her and made a note, and then she looked around the room once and appeared to find it satisfactory. One of the 12 was Lucius Malfoy. She knew him by reputation, which was the way most people knew him. He had a reputation for understanding which way things were moving before they moved, and for finding a position from which to observe the movement that was neither entirely visible nor entirely removed. He was tall and very pale, with white blonde hair worn long, and he moved through the chamber with the unhurried ease of someone who had spent a lifetime in rooms like this and saw no reason to adjust himself to any of them. His son Draco was a first-year Slytherin. Pomfrey had treated him briefly in September, and had formed the view that the boy was going to be exactly what his father's reputation suggested a child of that upbringing would be. She was aware that Lucius Malfoy had reasons of his own to support an inquiry into Albus Dumbledore, reasons that were considerably older than Harry Potter's medical file and considerably less altruistic than her own, and she was aware that this did not make the inquiry wrong. It made Malfoy complicated. The inquiry was what it was, regardless. He took the third seat from the right, beside a heavy-set wizard she didn't know, and said nothing to anyone, and watched the room with his pale eyes in the manner of a man filing information for uses he had not yet decided upon. McGonagall was seated at the end, designated for witnesses, in the chair to Pomfrey's left. They had said what needed to be said across the 7 days preceding today. There was nothing to add now. McGonagall sat with the straight-backed deliberateness she brought to everything that required her to be in a room and not show what she was thinking, and Pomfrey sat beside her and kept her hand still in her lap and observed. Harry Potter's file and James Potter's file were on the table between the parties, in the position the senior governor had indicated when Pomfrey arrived. At 10:05, the door at the far end of the chamber opened, and Albus Dumbledore came in. He came alone. No legal representative, no colleague, no one to stand beside him or carry his case. He walked into the room, as he walked into every room, fully present from the moment he appeared, without any of the subtle hesitation that most people displayed when entering a space that held something they would rather not face. He wore his robes and his half-moon spectacles, and carried nothing at all, and Pomfrey, watching from her seat at the side of the room, thought, "He is not surprised. He was not surprised when I came to his office. He was not surprised by McGonagall's involvement. He is not surprised by this room. He may be the only person in it who is not, in some way, surprised by the fact that it exists." He took the seat the senior governor indicated. He settled his robes. He looked at the 12 governors with a clear and unhurried attention that did not flinch from any of them, and they looked at him, and the room settled into the particular stillness that comes just before a formal proceeding begins, and everyone in it understands that what follows cannot be undone. The senior governor opened her folio. She read the submission into the record, all of it. Pomfrey's comparative medical analysis, the intake measurements for Harry Potter and James Potter side by side, the timeline of Harry's placement at number 4 Privet Drive, beginning on the 1st of November 1981, the identification of the surveillance arrangement the headmaster had disclosed voluntarily. She read it in the flat, precise voice of a person who understood that the facts were sufficient and required no editorial emphasis. Pomfrey had written the document carefully, and with exactly this moment in mind, and as she listened to her own words rendered in another woman's voice in a stone chamber she had not known existed a week ago, she felt the particular, weightless sensation of something that had lived inside one person becoming a matter of record. The reading ended. The senior governor set the parchment down. Across the table, Dumbledore was still. The 12 governors looked at him across the length of the table, across the 2 files that sat there in the center. Outside, in the corridor beyond the closed door, the castle was quiet in a way that Hogwarts was not usually quiet, a quality of attention in the stone and the air and the portraits lining the halls, as if the building understood, in whatever manner very old buildings understood things, that what was happening in this room mattered. Something had begun that could not be unbegun. She had heard Albus Dumbledore speak in formal settings more times than she could readily count. Faculty meetings, ministry addresses, the opening feast every September where he said things that sounded simple and were not. She had sat through more than 3 decades of his public voice, and she knew it the way you knew any instrument heard across a long time, its range, its qualities in different registers, the adjustments it made when the audience or the stakes changed. She knew when he was giving the fullest account available to him. He stood at his end of the table and he spoke, and what she heard was the fullest account. He began with the blood protection charm. He explained it the way he explained everything he considered genuinely important, without flourish, starting with the truth of the thing and working outward. Lily Potter, he said, had died for her son. He paused to acknowledge that this was not, in the context of that war, a remarkable fact. Many people had died for others in those years. What was remarkable was the manner in which Lily Potter's death had operated magically. Her sacrifice, freely and deliberately chosen in the moment when she could have survived if she had simply stepped aside, had created in Harry a protection so ancient and powerful that it could not be replicated by any deliberate enchantment. The magic was older than any of the dark arts Voldemort had mastered. It was, in the most literal sense, love made into law, and it had a condition. For the charm to remain active, Harry needed to be able to call the home of Lily's blood a home. He needed to be able to return to it at least once a year. If that connection dissolved, if he could no longer, in the relevant magical sense, call that place his own, the protection would dissolve with it. Dumbledore had understood this in the early hours of the 1st of November 1981. He had identified Lily's elder sister Petunia as the blood relative through whom the charm could be anchored. When Petunia accepted the child into her house, the magic sealed itself around him. He had placed Harry at the Dursleys' doorstep, having weighed, he said this plainly and without apology, the charm's requirement against the family's suitability, and had concluded that the magical protection outweighed the suitability concern. The protection, he said, had likely preserved Harry Potter's life more than once in the years since. McGonagall did not look at Dumbledore while he said this. She looked at the table, at Harry Potter's file resting in the center of it, at the particular inadequacy of medical measurements on a page when held against words like freely chosen and love made into law. She thought about the cold November wall outside number 4 and what she had told him, and she thought, he has said nothing false. The blood protection was a real and ancient mechanism. The condition he was describing was established in the texts. The placement decision, given the charm's requirements, had a logic she could follow, even if she had not been able to accept it at the time. She continued to believe him, and remained entirely still. He turned, then, to a prophecy. He was careful about this, as he was always careful with this particular subject. He identified its existence, described its relevance, that it concerned Harry specifically, that it concerned the eventual return of the force that had killed his parents, that it had shaped his understanding of why Harry's survival had to be the foremost consideration rather than one among several. He did not quote it. He said clearly, "I cannot repeat it in a setting of this kind without directly endangering the person it concerns, and I will not do that." He said this with an evident awareness that the board had every right to be frustrated by it, and with no apparent intention of changing course regardless. 3 of the governors made notes. The senior governor's expression did not move. He raised Arabella Figg before being asked. Minerva recognized the deliberateness of this choice. He was naming her voluntarily, in the interest of a complete accounting, because he would not have the board learn of this arrangement from any source other than himself. He described Figg as a squib, a person of magical descent without magical ability herself, whom he had placed in the street adjacent to the Dursley home to observe Harry's circumstances and report back. She had been there from early in the arrangement. She had reported regularly. He framed this transparency as it was intended to be framed, as evidence of good faith, as demonstration that his oversight had not been negligent in the ways one might imagine if one did not know of Figg's existence. The governor 3 seats from the right, a thin woman with narrow spectacles who had not spoken until this moment, leaned forward. She asked, if those reports identified concerns about the child's welfare, what actions followed? Dumbledore said the reports had indicated Harry was present and in no obvious danger. The thin governor said, "The medical evidence before this board suggests the child's welfare across 10 years was not what the word safe would ordinarily imply." Dumbledore said he understood the concern. He said that he now recognized, treated safety and well-being as equivalent measures when they were not. The senior governor said, "The board would like to know whether any alternative guardianship arrangement was ever considered during the 10 years following the initial placement. The blood protection, as the board understands it, requires a blood relative of Lily Potter's. Were there other such relatives identified and assessed?" Minerva had known Albus Dumbledore for over 30 years. She had never, in that time, seen him silent for a beat too long in a formal proceeding. He was, among his many substantial qualities, a man who knew when to speak and how, who inhabited the language of formal discourse the way he inhabited everything, entirely without apparent effort. He was silent for a beat too long. He said then that the Dursley placement had satisfied the charm's requirements, and that the question of additional investigation had not been prioritized. The session recessed for 8 minutes after that. The governors conferred. Dumbledore was still. Harry Potter's file remained in the center of the table, which Minerva thought was probably not accidental. When the session resumed, it moved more briefly than it had before, and when it concluded, Dumbledore rose, thanked the governors for the proceeding, and moved toward the door. He still walked as he had always walked, with the unhurried gravity of a man who had never in his life needed to hurry, because the world arranged itself around his pace, which was not arrogance so much as the accumulated weight of a century of being, in fact, the most significant person in whatever room he occupied. The 12 governors did not look up as he left. 4 of them were already in quiet conversation, heads bent, with the particular focused attention of people reviewing evidence rather than managing impressions. McGonagall sat and watched the door close. She had, she thought, heard Albus Dumbledore give the fullest account available to him. She had watched him lay the blood protection argument before a room of governors who had no basis to disbelieve it, and she did not disbelieve it. She had watched him disclose Arabella Figg before being asked, which was tactically exact and personally genuine. She knew the difference in him, after so many years, between tactic and sincerity. And this had been both. She had watched him invoke the prophecy with his characteristic care for the people it endangered. She had watched, and she had listened, and she had arrived at the same place she'd been in Poppy Pomfrey's sitting room, only more clearly. The argument was real. The argument covered the placement. It did not cover the 10 years. And the senior governor's question about alternative relatives had revealed, in the beat of silence that followed it, that the gap between those two things was not an oversight or a complexity he had been unable to navigate. It was a choice that had not been re-examined. That was the problem, and no account, however full, was going to close it. She gathered her things and waited for McGonagall's role in the proceedings to be formally concluded, and then she left the room. The summons arrived on a Tuesday, through a formally worded letter delivered by a ministry owl, which informed him that the Board of Governors was exercising its right to call witnesses and that his attendance was not optional. Severus Snape had attended a great many things in his life that were not optional. He had learned to approach them all with the same quality, prepared indifference, which was different from actual indifference, and more useful. He dressed in his teaching robes. He walked to the second-floor chamber. He took the witness chair with the unhurried, precise movements of someone who had nothing to conceal and some experience of situations in which concealment was necessary regardless. The senior governor addressed him before he could speak. The board, she said, was aware of the documented personal history between Professor Snape and the Potter family, specifically the deep and mutual antagonism between himself and the late James Potter, with whom he had shared a year group at Hogwarts from September 1971 through June 1978. She asked him to confine his testimony to factual observation. She asked him to acknowledge, for the record, that personal feeling had no place in what the board required of him today. He said, naturally. He said it in the tone of a man who had been managing personal feeling inside professional contexts for his entire adult life and did not require instruction in the practice. They asked about James Potter. He told them. He described James Harold Potter at age 11 with the specific and unsentimental accuracy of someone who had spent 7 formative years studying a person they despised, which demands its own kind of attention. James Potter had arrived at Hogwarts in September 1971 in the exact condition that the son of Fleamont and Euphemia Potter had every reason to arrive in. Healthy, physically confident, robust in the way of a child whose body had never been given reason to understand deprivation. He was tall for his age. He was well fed, not in the faint sense of adequately nourished, but in the fuller sense of generously provided for, the kind of well-fed that registered immediately and without analysis, that was visible in the quality of his skin and the straightness of his posture, and the way he moved through the world with the complete ease of someone for whom there had always been enough. His robes fit. He occupied whatever space he was in with the unself-conscious assurance of a boy who had simply never, in 11 years, had reason to doubt that things were arranged for his benefit, because they always had been. Snape said, "I despised James Potter thoroughly, and with what I considered, and still consider, adequate justification. Despising him, however, required me to see him accurately. I did." The thin governor with the narrow spectacles said, "Thank you, Professor. That is consistent with the evidence the board has received from other sources. They indicated that his testimony had reached the scope defined for it." They thanked him. He said, "There is one further observation." The senior governor said, "The defined scope of Professor Snape's testimony covers James Potter's Hogwarts years. Please confine yourself to that period." He said, "Potter, the son, resembles his father closely. I teach him. The resemblance is, for reasons you may infer from the history already on your record, not one I find easy. But I have had Harry Potter in my classroom since September of this year. He does not look like a child who has been raised the way James Potter was raised, the thin governor said. That observation falls outside the defined scope. He said, it is an observation of fact. I leave the board to determine what use to make of it. A pause. 4 seconds approximately. The senior governor made a note. 3 governors looked at one another. Then the session was concluded, and he was thanked and dismissed. He walked from the chamber through corridors that were, at midday, largely empty. He thought about it anyway. He had said, he does not look like a child who has been raised the same way. This was true. He had been able to say it with the full authority of someone who had observed it across 3 months, and the authority was real, because he had observed it. Harry Potter had sat in his classroom since September. Snape had spent each of those sessions regarding the boy with the focused, specific attention of someone who found the sight of him, the particular shape of James Potter's face, on a smaller and considerably less assured body, difficult for reasons that were his own, and that he did not examine in daylight hours. And what he had chosen, daily, with the full, deliberate awareness of a man who knew what he was choosing not to notice, was that the smaller body was thin. Too thin. Thin in a way that had nothing to do with constitution and everything to do with 10 years of something he had looked at and declined to see, because seeing it would have required him to be the person who acted on it, and he had not wanted, in September, to be that person for Harry Potter. He thought about this with the same precision he brought to potions work, without softening the analysis, without qualifying the conclusion in ways that would make it easier to carry. The laboratory was cold in the way of deep dungeon rooms that stone kept insulated from the school's warmer frequencies. He had 3 cauldrons on the long bench, 1 simmering at a low blue flame, 2 cooling. The smell of the room was one he had worked in for most of his adult life, and he found it clarifying the way other people found open air clarifying. He sat on the stool at the far end of the bench and did not light additional lamps and let the dark gather in from the corners. He thought about Lily Potter. He did not do this directly, as a rule. He had spent 11 years developing the skill of thinking around the edges of her, of approaching what she meant to him by way of things adjacent, things she had been part of, things that led from her, and it cost him less than the direct route, and was, in practice, sufficient. He was not generally a man who underestimated the cost of the direct route and took it anyway. Tonight, he took it anyway. He thought about Lily Evans, who had been the first person in his life to look at him without the particular flinch that Spinner's End and second-hand clothes and Tobias Snape's general legacy produced in most people, and who had been his friend before he understood that friendship was a thing available to him, and who had died on the 31st of October 1981 because she had placed herself between her child and a curse she knew she could not survive. This was the most Lily Evans thing she had ever done. It was the last thing she had done. He thought about the 10 years after. Lily Potter had died in October 1981. Her son had spent the subsequent 10 years in a house where he had been, by the evidence of the medical file in that chamber, and by Snape's own 3 months of teaching record, consistently and substantially provided with less than he required. He had arrived at Hogwarts in September of this year, too thin and too careful, and with the practiced self-containment of a child who had long since learned that his needs were not a reasonable priority for the people around him. Snape had seen all of this in September, with the clarity of a man trained to observe, and he had seen none of it, because he had looked at Harry Potter and he had seen James Potter's face, and looking at James Potter's face had always, for the past 20 years, been the end of what he was willing to see. He sat with this. He thought, without permitting himself to know he was thinking it, about Spinner's End, about the particular quality of a house that was quiet because something had just happened that everyone in it was pretending hadn't, about the arithmetic of second-hand robes, the calculation of how old something could be before wearing it announced the thing you were trying not to announce, about being 11 years old in a school full of children who had been given things and knowing, with the resigned certainty of a child who had known it long enough that it no longer felt like knowledge and simply felt like the shape of things, that asking would not help. He did not name the connection between those thoughts and the boy in his potions class. He was a man who had spent his entire life refusing to name the connections that hurt him. The refusal had a purpose. It made things bearable that would otherwise not be, and he did not repent of it. He simply sat in the cold laboratory with the one simmering cauldron's blue light for company, and thought around the edges of things he would not look at directly until the cauldron required his attention, and then he attended to it, and then he went to teach, and he did not look at Harry Potter's thin wrists during the defense class, and he told himself this was a form of control. He had always been very good at control. The inquiry had been going on for weeks. Harry knew this the way he knew most things at Hogwarts that weren't in the textbooks, through the texture of rooms when he walked into them, through the way certain conversations stopped when he approached, through the expression on Professor McGonagall's face when she passed Dumbledore in the corridors, which was an expression he didn't have a name for. He knew that something was happening. He didn't know yet that it was about him. Hermione had known more since the second week of the inquiry, which was when she'd found the relevant section in Hogwarts, a history while looking for something else entirely, and had read the chapter on Board of Governors procedures with the expression she wore when she was learning something she didn't yet know how to use. She'd told Ron about it that night, quietly, and Ron had listened in the way Ron listened to things that were complicated and involved Harry, which was carefully, without looking directly at the source of the complication. Harry had noticed this. He hadn't said anything, because he was accustomed to not saying things and waiting for them to arrive on their own schedule. "Hermione's been reading about wizarding lore," he said one afternoon in the common room, watching her across the table where she had 3 books open, and the look on her face that meant she was upset and not ready to talk about it. "Yeah," said Ron. "Is it to do with whatever's happening with the board?" Ron looked at him. "I think so." Harry looked at Hermione. She looked up from her book, saw him looking, and looked back down. He didn't push. He filed it under things that would arrive when they were ready, which was a category of knowledge he had been maintaining since he was approximately 5. The note from McGonagall arrived on a Wednesday, in her compact, decisive hand. "Potter. My office. 5 o'clock. She was standing when he arrived. He had noticed she did this sometimes when she had something to say that she preferred to be on her feet for. She told him to sit. He sat. Then she sat as well, folded her hands on the desk and said, "I want to tell you something before you hear it another way. I think you should hear it from me." He waited. "Several weeks ago," she said, "Madame Pomfrey came to me with a concern. She had examined you after your Quidditch match and found markers in your health records, measurements that suggested you had not been adequately provided for over a significant period of time at your aunt and uncle's home. She compared those records against records she held from your father's time at this school. The difference between them was not minor." Harry was still. "Madame Pomfrey reported her findings to the Board of Governors. The board has opened a formal inquiry. The inquiry is reviewing the decision that was made in November 1981 to place you with your aunt and uncle after your parents were killed. It is reviewing whether the people responsible for your welfare discharged that responsibility across the past 10 years. She paused. I wanted you to hear that plainly. He heard it. He understood each word and what the words assembled in that order meant. Something about him, happening right now in a room somewhere in this building. He thought about the Quidditch match, the hospital wing, Madame Pomfrey asking about meals at home. He thought about the answer he'd given. He said, "Did Dumbledore know what the Dursleys were like?" McGonagall looked at him directly. Yes. How? He had placed someone in Little Whinging, someone he trusted to observe the situation and report to him. She had been doing that for 10 years. Harry thought about Privet Drive. He thought about Mrs. Figg, who sometimes babysat him when the Dursleys went out, who had made him look at photographs of her cats and hadn't given him much to eat. He thought about whether she had been watching and reporting, and what she had reported, and what had happened as a result of those reports. He said, he knew, and he didn't change anything. McGonagall said, "The matter is before the board. It is not for me to characterize his choices before they conclude." A pause. But yes, he knew. Harry was quiet. Then he said, "Was there anyone else who could have taken me in, instead of the Dursleys?" McGonagall went very still. She was looking at him across the desk with the particular quality of stillness that was itself an answer, and he was good enough at reading rooms, at reading the unspoken contents of rooms, had been good at it since long before he knew what Hogwarts was, to understand the answer before she said anything more. "There was a godfather," she said. "He is not available." He waited. "That is a separate situation, and not one I can explain to you fully today. I want you to know that I am aware of it." He didn't ask anything further. He thanked her, and he left. He walked down from her office without deciding where he was going, and arrived, 20 minutes later, outside the hospital wing. He had not planned this. He had simply walked, and the corridor had taken him here, which seemed about accurate. Madame Pomfrey was at her desk. She looked up when he pushed open the door. She did not say anything at all. She came around the desk and said, "Sit down," in the tone that was not a suggestion, and he sat in the chair nearest the door, because he was the kind of child who had always been instinctively obedient to people who used that particular register. She went into the small room off the main ward. He heard the sounds of a kettle and cups. She came back with tea and set it in front of him without asking if he wanted it. He wrapped his hands around the cup. Neither of them spoke. The ward was empty. Afternoon light came through the high windows at the low angle of late November, and he thought that this was the room where she had sat with 2 files on the desk, and where something had happened on his behalf that had been happening without his knowledge, and he didn't know what to feel about that, except that he did feel something, and it was not small, and it was not anger. After a while she set the 2 files on the table beside his tea. She opened them and did not explain. She simply made them available. He looked. James Harold Potter, age 11, September 1971. He read the entry in Pomfrey's handwriting, the compact, precise hand he recognized from the questions she had asked him after the match, and he read his father's measurements, and he looked at his own, and he held both facts in his mind at the same time, turning them over the way you turned something over when you were trying to understand the shape of it. His father had been 11. His father had been healthy. He had arrived at Hogwarts in September 1971, and it was all written here. Height, weight, general assessment, no anomalies noted. A boy who had been taken care of. A boy whose home had provided things in the ordinary, unremarkable way that homes were supposed to provide things. The way Harry had known for exactly 2 months that homes could provide things, the way he had spent 11 years not quite knowing, was possible. Harry looked at this for a long time. He was not angry. He was something quieter than angry, something with a longer reach and less heat. He was trying to understand the shape of a thing he didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't quite grief, and it wasn't quite realization. It was something in the range of, someone looked. Someone took 2 files out of a cabinet and placed them side by side and looked at them, and what they saw was enough to change things, and for 10 years no one had done that. Not because it was difficult to do. Because no one had done it. Because no one had wanted to know what was in those files side by side, or hadn't thought of it, or had thought of it, and had decided there were bigger considerations. He should not have cost this much to see. That was the thing he kept arriving at, in the quiet of the ward, with his cold tea and his father's file, and the November evening coming on outside. He should not have required a formal inquiry, and a board of governors and weeks of institutional process for someone to look at him and see what was there. It should have taken less. He didn't know how much less. He just knew it should have been less. Madame Pomfrey sat across the table and did not speak. He was grateful for this in a way he could not have articulated, because he did not have the language yet for being grateful that an adult understood when to be quiet. He had not had much occasion to develop it. The ward lamps lit themselves when the light failed, softly and without announcement, the way things happened in Hogwarts that were tended to whether or not anyone was paying attention. He looked up at them, and then back at the files. He thanked her. He put on his robe and left, and he walked back up through the castle with his hands in his pockets, and the particular feeling of someone who has just been told a true thing and has not yet worked out what to do with the knowledge that it is true. The board's letter to the Ministry of Magic went out on a Monday. Pomfrey knew this because McGonagall told her, briefly, in the corridor outside the hospital wing, on her way to a class she was already almost late for. The board required access to records outside the school's own files, records held in a private arrangement between the headmaster and a civilian observer he had placed in Harry Potter's street. The ministry would need to be formally involved to compel those records. McGonagall said this in the economical way she had, the way of a woman who communicated what was necessary and left the conclusions to the person receiving the information. And then she walked on, and Pomfrey went back into the hospital wing and sat at her desk for 4 minutes before she opened her appointments register and resumed the day. She had expected this. The inquiry had a logic to it. She had known from the first week that it would eventually reach the ministry, because Dumbledore had placed Arabella Figg, a civilian, outside the school, technically outside the board's direct authority. And those records, if they existed in any documented form, could not be compelled by the board alone. The ministry's Department of Magical Law Enforcement would need to issue a formal notice. This was not a surprise. It was the next step. What she had not anticipated was how long the next step would take. McGonagall reported, at intervals, that the formal notice had not been issued. Pomfrey did not press. She knew the difference between delay that was procedural and delay that was political, and these two things were not always distinguishable from outside the room where the delay was occurring. The reason for the delay arrived through McGonagall, who delivered it in 3 sentences. The Minister for Magic had not formally opposed the inquiry. He had also not formally supported it. He was, as the senior governor had informed McGonagall, experiencing administrative considerations that required his personal attention, which everyone with any familiarity with the ministry understood to mean that Cornelius Fudge did not want to be the minister who had pressed the case against Albus Dumbledore, and was buying himself time to find an arrangement that did not require him to be. Pomfrey did not have opinions about Fudge. The ministry was a place where the people with the most power to act were frequently the people most reluctant to exercise it when the exercise had political consequences. She had believed this since approximately 1975 and saw no reason to revise it. She sat with the information, and she waited. Amelia Bones was not Fudge. The distinction was clear in the letter McGonagall brought to the hospital wing on a Wednesday in December. The head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement wrote that the Ministry of Magic was formally participating in the oversight review initiated by the Board of Governors. The DMLE had issued a notice requiring production of all records held by Arabella Figg, Squib, of Wisteria Walk, relating to her observations of number 4, Privet Drive, over the period November 1981 through September 1991. The records had been received. The last sentence of Bones's letter said, "The records are extensive." Pomfrey read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it and put it beneath the other papers on her desk, and she sat very still for a while, thinking about the phrase 10 years in the specific context of a decade of written observations, and what those observations might have said, and whether Arabella Figg had seen the same things Pomfrey had seen when Harry Potter sat in this ward in November and answered questions about meals at home with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had never had reason to understand that his answers were unusual. The summary of Figg's records arrived 2 weeks later in a sealed envelope from the DMLE addressed to the board and copied to Pomfrey in her capacity as the submitting medical professional. She read it at her desk in the early morning, before the ward required her attention. 10 years. Figg had been reporting to Dumbledore since November 1981, placed in Wisteria Walk from the first weeks of Harry's life at number 4. Annual reports and supplemental observations in the careful handwriting of a woman who had been told to watch and had done so to the best of her ability. Most of the reports said, "The boy appears physically well. He is present. He attends school. He is seen in the street." There was no particular alarm in any of them. No indicator of crisis, no notation of obvious injury, nothing that would have required immediate response. The phrasing varied very little from year to year. The boy appears well. The child looks well enough. He appears to be healthy. Pomfrey set the summary down and looked at the opposite wall for a while. She was a healer. Figg was not. The word well, used without clinical tools or a baseline for comparison, meant nothing alarmed you, which was not the same as a positive assessment. Figg was a squib with no medical training who had done what she was equipped to do, watch from a neighboring street and report on what she saw. A child who was present and did not display obvious signs of acute distress. She had reported that faithfully for 10 years. It had not been enough to see him. The entry from September 1991 was at the back of the summary. It was the most recent one. The boy left for Hogwarts on the 1st of September. He was thin for his age. She had noted this. She had written it down and sent it to Dumbledore. And the report had arrived, and the entry was in the file, and Harry Potter had been put on the Hogwarts Express, and nothing had been done. Pomfrey sat with that sentence for a long time. Thin for his age. 4 words, written down and received and filed, and, so far as the records indicated, considered insufficient to require action. The medical evidence she had produced in November, the comparative analysis she had assembled on an evening when she had gone to her filing cabinet for purely professional reasons, had found its way into a formal inquiry, reshaping the institutional structure of the wizarding world's most significant school. And in a report filed by a woman who watched from a street, the same information had been present in 4 words since August, quietly waiting for someone to look at it. McGonagall came to her late that week and told her Fudge had visited Hogwarts. He had arrived in the afternoon and gone directly to the headmaster's office. The meeting had not been announced. The castle staff knew about it, the way they knew about everything at Hogwarts, through the particular attention portraits gave to certain doors. He had been there for approximately an hour. Dumbledore had received him with perfect courtesy. He had offered tea, she understood, and conversation, and had said nothing that required the minister to act. He had not asked Fudge to stop the inquiry. He had not asked him to intervene in the board's proceedings. He had not asked him for anything at all. He had simply been Albus Dumbledore, over a century of it. And then Fudge had gone, and Dumbledore had gone back to running his school. McGonagall said, "He knows there is nothing to stop." She said it the way she said things she found terrible and necessary at the same time, which was with a flatness that was harder to hear than open anger. Pomfrey said nothing. She was thinking about what it meant to receive a minister for magic, offer him tea, and make no request, whether it was the act of a man who trusted the process he was subject to, or the act of a man who believed himself beyond it. She was not certain these two things were distinguishable from the outside. The formal letter from Amelia Bones arrived on a Friday. It was addressed to the Board of Governors and copied to all named parties in the inquiry. It confirmed the Ministry's formal participation in the Oversight Review. The DMLE had received and reviewed Arabella Figg's records and entered them into the Board's formal evidence. The inquiry had the Ministry's formal endorsement as a legitimate exercise of governance authority. One paragraph at the end. The DMLE noted that the September 1991 entry in Figg's records, specifically the notation that the child left for Hogwarts thin for his age, had been present in the file received by the headmaster's office and had produced no documented response. Pomfrey read the letter and set it down beside the other correspondence that had accumulated on her desk across the past weeks. The inquiry had its own weight now. Two institutional bodies, Figg's 10 years of reports, the September entry, the comparative analysis she had assembled on an evening in November when she had pulled two files from a cabinet and placed them side by side. She had let the evidence into the world, and the evidence had done what evidence did when it was solid and documented and had a decade behind it. It had found its way to the people who had the authority to act on it. She went back to work. December came to Hogwarts the way December always came, with cold that entered through the stones and the high windows and settled into the corridors in layers. But the cold this year had company. The school was carrying something else, a quality of attention, a particular alertness in the space between teachers and in the way certain conversations stopped when students came close. Harry had noticed it in October. It had not lessened through November. By the first week of December, it was simply part of the texture of the place, like the moving staircases or the temperature of the dungeons. Something was happening in the parts of the school he was not allowed to be in, and it was still happening, and it involved him, and he knew it, and the school knew he knew it, and no one said anything directly. Hermione had 3 books on the table in the library the first week of December that had nothing to do with their coursework. Harry sat across from her and watched her read with the focused, slightly tense expression she wore when she was learning something that upset her. Ron sat beside him, working on a transfiguration essay with the resigned industry of someone who had calculated that finishing by dinner was achievable if he didn't stop to think. "What are those?" Harry said. Hermione looked up. She glanced at Ron, who kept writing. "Legal procedure," she said. "Governance records. Historical precedents for board proceedings." Harry considered this. "Are you looking for something specific?" She looked at him in the particular way that meant she had found something she wasn't sure she should share yet. "I'll tell you when I know more," she said, which was Hermione's version of yes. He did not push. He pulled his charms textbook toward him and attempted to study, and mostly succeeded, and did not think about the library of knowledge that Hermione was quietly assembling, except that he thought about it quite a lot. The school emptied at Christmas. Most students went home. Harry did not. He had no home to go to that he thought of as home. And Ron stayed too, and Hermione left on the 23rd with a wave and 2 extra books she was borrowing. The castle was quieter, with 3/4 of the students gone, the common room warm and firelit and enormous in its emptiness, the corridors easier to walk in because there was no one to walk past. It was during this emptied week that he found the mirror. He had been wandering, the aimless, unambitious wandering of someone with hours and nowhere they were required to be, which was a kind of freedom that still felt slightly unfamiliar, the way good things sometimes did. He had gone down a corridor he hadn't been down before, and turned left where he thought there was a wall, and found instead a room he had never seen, with no candles lit and cold air that smelled of dust and old stone. In the center of the room, propped against the wall, was a mirror. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went inside. The mirror was enormous, taller than he was, taller than any mirror he had seen, framed in something that might have been gold, with an inscription running along the top that he couldn't quite pass. His reflection looked back at him. It was him, just him, in the ordinary robes and glasses. And then, he wasn't sure when it happened, it wasn't just him. There was a woman behind him. Dark red hair, bright green eyes. His eyes, the exact color of his eyes, which people sometimes mentioned, and which he had not understood until now as something that came from somewhere. And beside her, a man, taller, with untidy dark hair and glasses not so different from his own. And more, behind them, people he didn't know, who had faces that were nevertheless in some way familiar, arranged around his parents in the way families arrange themselves in photographs. Harry stood very still. His parents looked back at him from inside the glass. He had looked at his father's school file in November, at the handwriting and the measurements, and what they had meant, and he had understood on an intellectual level that his father had been 11 years old and healthy and cared for. He had held the file in his hands. Standing in front of this mirror, he understood it differently. His mother was standing there. His father was standing there. They were looking at him out of the glass with an expression he didn't have a word for. Not pride exactly, not grief exactly. Something that incorporated both things and several others besides, something too large to fit in a single feeling. He thought about the hospital wing in November, the 2 files side by side on the table. James Harold Potter, September 1971. Height, weight, general assessment. A boy who had been provided for. And then the other file, which was his, which said something different, which had been what Madame Pomfrey had seen and had been unable to set aside. He thought about what it would have been like to have grown up in a house where his parents were, and what that house might have been like, and what he might have been like. And then he stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it too directly was a specific kind of pain he was still learning how to manage. He saw Professor Quirrell near the 3rd-floor corridor on 2 occasions during this same week, which should have been unremarkable. Teachers walked through the castle, and Quirrell's classroom was not far, except that Quirrell's face, when Harry glimpsed it those 2 times, was not the face of a man walking a familiar route. He was standing very still the first time, his back to Harry, looking at the locked door at the corridor's end. The second time he wasn't there when Harry looked again, which was its own kind of odd. Harry filed it under things he had noticed without knowing what to do with, which was a category that had been growing steadily since September. On the last night before the other students returned, he told Ron. Ron was sitting up in his bunk, reading a Chudley Cannon's almanac with the concentration he usually saved for Quidditch practice. Harry came in from the corridor and sat on his own bed and said, "I found a mirror." Ron looked up. "What kind of mirror?" "The kind that shows you things." He tried to explain it. He said, "You look in it, and you see what you want most, or what you want so much you've nearly stopped knowing you want it." He said, "I saw my parents." Ron was quiet for a moment. "Both of them. Both of them." Ron set the almanac down. He had the careful look he wore when he knew something mattered and was thinking about how to be useful, which was a look Harry had come to trust almost as much as any comfort, because it meant Ron was taking it seriously. He didn't say anything about it being sad, or about Harry being unlucky, or any of the other things people sometimes said that were true and also didn't quite land anywhere useful. He said, "Do they look how you thought they would?" Harry considered this properly. "Sort of," he said. "My mum has my eyes. And my dad." He stopped. He thought about the school file, the measurements, the boy who had arrived at Hogwarts in September 1971, healthy and intact and whole. And then he said, "My dad looked like someone who'd been looked after." Ron didn't say anything, but he looked at Harry with the particular directness that Ron had when he had understood something and was choosing not to make more of it than it was, which was the correct response, and Harry was grateful for it. That night, very late, Harry was awake, not anxious, simply awake, which happened when he heard footsteps in the corridor outside the dormitory. He recognized the deliberate precision of them, and was not surprised, a minute later, to see from his window the figure of Professor McGonagall crossing the courtyard below, heading toward the main castle entrance. She was coming from the direction of the headmaster's office. He thought about this for a while, looking at the dark courtyard and the faint light in the window at the base of the tower that was Dumbledore's office, which meant Dumbledore was still at his desk at whatever hour this was, still working, still carrying the machinery of the school. And he thought about McGonagall making that walk to that office, for whatever reason, and coming back the way she had come. He didn't know what had happened in the room. He didn't need to. He lay back down and looked at the dark ceiling and thought about his parents' faces in the glass, and about the inquiry that was still grinding forward in its institutional way through December and into the new year, and about what Hermione had found and told him. He thought, something is going to change. He didn't know what or when. He had spent enough of his life not knowing what was coming to be patient with the not knowing. He was good at waiting. He had always been good at waiting. He closed his eyes. January moved around him, cold and unhurried, through the old stone walls. The board had been deliberating for 3 days. Dumbledore had spent those days doing what he always did. He had run the school. Correspondence, scheduling, dinner in the Great Hall, all of it with the complete, unhurried attention of a man who had learned, across a very long life, that the quality of attention you gave your days while waiting determined the kind of person you were when the thing arrived. The 3 days ended on a Thursday morning. The senior governor received him in the small anteroom adjacent to the formal hearing chamber, which told him something. She was alone, which told him something else. She did not offer him a seat. She read the outcome into the record in the flat, precise voice she had used throughout. The Board of Governors of Hogwarts, School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, having reviewed the evidence presented, having heard the testimony of witnesses, having considered the arguments on both sides, found that the matter in question was not the headmaster's placement of Harry Potter with Petunia Dursley and her family on the 1st of November 1981. The board acknowledged the blood protection charm's requirements and acknowledged the genuine magical necessity that had informed that decision. The board's finding was not that the original placement had been wrong, The board's finding was the decade. 10 years in which Arabella Figg's reports had arrived and been read and filed. 10 years in which alternative arrangements had not been sought. The September 1991 notation, thin for his age, had been received by the headmaster's office and had produced no documented action. The blood protection charm required Harry Potter to be able to call Petunia Dursley's house a home and return there at least once a year. It did not require the neglect of his welfare across 10 years of documented knowledge. The board was not persuaded that it did. Effective immediately, Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore was removed as headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The vote had not been unanimous. The blood protection argument had created genuine ambivalence, as he had understood it would. It had not created a majority. Deputy Headmistress Minerva McGonagall would serve as acting headmistress, pending a formal appointment process. The senior governor folded the parchment. She looked at him across the small room. She said, "The board appreciates that this is a difficult outcome." She said it with the dignified restraint of a woman who understood that he required no particular handling. He said, "Thank you for the full proceeding." He meant it. She appeared to understand that he meant it. He left the anteroom and walked back through the castle to his office. He went into his office. Fawkes was on his perch, his feathers the deep red and gold of a bird in fine health, his black eyes tracking Dumbledore across the room with the particular attention of a creature that was very old and not in the least fooled by composure. Dumbledore sat in the chair behind the desk. The silver instruments continued their small workings. The portraits of former headmasters occupied the walls, some watching, some with the closed eyes of whatever portraits did when they were not performing attention. He observed that he would be one of them, eventually. He found he had no particular feeling about it. He had 1 hour before the school's administrative functions would formally transfer. He did not spend the hour packing, because there was nothing here that was his in the way of personal possession. It was all the school's. He sat with Fawkes, and he thought. He asked himself the question that he suspected everyone waiting for this outcome had been asking themselves, which was, would he make the same choices again? He held the question honestly, which was the only way he had ever been able to hold difficult questions. He had placed Harry Potter with the Dursleys in November 1981 because the blood protection charm required it, and because a child alive was better than a child exposed, and because the prophecy had told him this child would be the one, and he had taken that seriously. He did not regret those choices in any simple way, but there were 10 years between 1981 and 1991. Figg's reports had arrived and been read and noted. Harry Potter had arrived at Hogwarts thin and careful and self-contained in the way of a child who had spent years not being anyone's primary consideration, and Dumbledore had seen him and thought, he is here now, where I can account for him. He had thought, this is the important thing. He had been correct about the important thing. He had been incorrect about whether that exempted him from the other things. This was the distinction the board had drawn, and sitting in the office he would leave in 50 minutes. He could not dispute it. He would make the same choices, he thought. That was the honest answer. He would place Harry's survival above Harry's comfort again, because survival was the precondition for everything else, and the prophecy's stakes had been real. He would consider that necessary. He would trust the architecture of the protection and Figg's nearby presence, and the child's evident survival as sufficient evidence that the arrangement was functioning. And that, precisely, was the problem. A man who would make the same choices again had not been changed by consequences. He had simply been moved from a desk he had occupied for 40 years to elsewhere. Still himself. Still certain of the same calculations. The school had ended his tenure. It had not ended his certainty. He was not sure whether to find this humbling or damning, and suspected it was both. Forks made a sound. Not a trill. Something lower. Something that functioned less as music and more as acknowledgement. Dumbledore looked at him. "Yes," he said. "I know." He left the office at the appointed hour. He did not look back at the door as it closed. He had the corridors and the portraits and the particular quality of the castle's air in September in his memory, in the way of a thing given 40 years to, not carefully but all the way down, less a set of memories than a way of knowing where he was in a familiar room. He would carry that. The castle would carry a version of him. He walked out into the March air and did not return. McGonagall came to the Gryffindor common room at 5 o'clock. Harry had known something was happening. He had spent the day in the careful normalcy he employed when waiting, attending to classes, eating lunch, walking the corridors, with part of himself elsewhere, because he was good at reading the temperature of environments, and the temperature today had been unmistakable. She asked him to come with her. He came. She told him in the corridor outside the portrait hole, which was where she had stopped, which meant she did not think this conversation required a room. She told him the verdict. Removed, effective immediately, acting headmistress as of today. She told him it plainly and without softening. He stood in the corridor and thought about it. He did not feel triumphant. He had not expected to feel triumphant. It had never been a word that fit this thing, but he had perhaps expected something simpler than what he actually felt, which was a grief with an unusual shape. For himself, for the 11 years, and then tangled in the same feeling, something that was almost also grief for Dumbledore, who was the reason the wizarding world had survived what it had survived, and who had failed Harry specifically while doing it. He did not know how to hold both things at once. He suspected it would take longer than 11 years to learn how. He thanked McGonagall. He went to Hagrid's. The hut was warm and smelled of wood smoke, and Fang, and just generally Hagrid. Hagrid was at his table. He had clearly been sitting there for a while, and he looked up when Harry came in with the expression of a man whose composure was visible precisely because it was taking effort. Hagrid loved Dumbledore. He always had. He would not stop. These were facts about Hagrid the way his size was a fact. Not decisions, but simply true things about the shape of him. Nothing about the verdict changed them. But he looked at Harry with something different in his face now, underneath the effort. He said carefully, "Yeah, all right?" "I think so," Harry said. "Not really." Hagrid nodded. He poured tea with the care he took when doing something simple, because the complicated things were not ready to be said. He handed Harry a cup so large it required 2 hands. They sat. Fang put his large head on Harry's knee. Outside, the March wind moved through the grounds, and neither of them said anything more for a while, which was all right. Knowing changed the look on a person's face in ways they could not control. Hagrid knew this now, and Harry saw that he knew, and they sat with the tea and Fang and all of it between them, unsaid, and not needing to be said. June arrived with the particular weight of a term that had been carrying something heavy since November, and everyone at Hogwarts was exhausted in the way of people who had been paying close attention for too long. McGonagall was acting headmistress, and was good at it, not the same as having wanted it this way, and the distinction between her competence and her ease was something everyone who spent time near her office could feel, a quality in the corridors like a string tuned slightly too tight. Quirrell had grown strange. Harry had noticed it, the way he noticed most things he wasn't supposed to notice, in increments, filed away without fully understanding. The flinching, which had always been present, had become something more directed. The Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom smelled wrong in a way Harry couldn't name. Quirrell moved through the castle in the last weeks of May with the particular purposefulness of someone who had made a decision and was only waiting on the moment to act on it. Harry had seen him near the third-floor corridor more than once. He had told Ron and Hermione. It was Hermione who saw it first for what it was. She had been in the library when the last pieces assembled themselves. The third-floor corridor, the trap-door, the large three-headed dog Harry had told them about in October, the Philosopher's Stone that Nicholas Flamel had entrusted to Dumbledore for safekeeping, and which was, evidently, hidden beneath the trap-door, and which someone was now trying to steal, and which, given the state of the school, the inquiry's aftermath, the institutional disruption of the past 7 months, was less well guarded than it had been in September when the castle was running as it always ran. She came to find them at dinner with her face arranged in the expression that meant she had figured something out and was not happy about it. They went the same night. The trap-door was where Harry had expected it to be, and the dog was what he had expected it to be, and the harp was still playing, and Ron said, "That's actually clever," about the harp before they dropped through. Then they were moving, down through the devil's snare that Hermione knew and named and defeated with wand-light, into the chamber with the winged keys where Harry's Quidditch training became the most useful thing he had, catching the right one while Ron and Hermione kept the others at bay. Then the chess chamber. Ron played chess the way he did everything he was genuinely good at, without apparent effort, and with an accuracy that bordered on something else, something more like instinct than calculation. He took the White Knight's position. He directed them forward. He saw the sacrifice required, and made it without arguing about it, which was not the same as being unafraid. Harry saw his face before the move, but was the correct response, and the board recognized it. The rook's move came, and Harry had time to look back once before the door opened. Ron was on the stone floor. He was breathing. The troll beyond was already unconscious. They went past it quickly. Snape's potions chamber was a row of 7 bottles of different sizes, arranged on a stone ledge, with a roll of parchment that described a logic puzzle in handwriting Harry recognized. He stood back while Hermione worked through it. She went through it twice, checked her reasoning, said the answer, and then went very still for a moment. "There's only enough for one," she said. Harry looked at the bottles. He already knew what she was going to say next. "You go forward," she said. "I'll go back for Ron. I'll get help." She paused. "Be careful." He didn't say anything to that. He took the correct bottle, drank what was required, and went through the black flame. The mirror was the first thing he saw. He had been in this room before, not this one, not underground in this stone chamber with the torches and the smell of cold air. But he had stood in front of that mirror in December, and he had looked at it until the ward lamps came on. And he knew what it showed, and he knew what he wanted, and he understood now, arriving at it in this context, why Dumbledore had put it here. If you could get through everything else and arrive in this room, the stone would be safe from anyone who wanted to use it. Because using it required a specific and particular kind of wanting, and the mirror would find it. Quirrell was already there. Harry had not thought about what it would look like. A teacher, a person he knew, standing in the torchlight with a face that was wrong in a way that wasn't entirely Quirrell anymore. That was something else looking through Quirrell's eyes. He said, "I wondered when I'd be meeting you, Potter." He didn't stammer. What happened next was fast, and not. There was a voice, not Quirrell's voice, something else, something without a body that spoke from everywhere, that told Quirrell to use the boy, to make the boy tell it what he saw, and Harry was looking at the mirror, and in the glass he saw himself, and then himself, with something in his pocket, and then he felt it, solid and cold and small. The stone was in his hand. He did not understand how, and then he did. He had wanted to find it, not use it, not keep it, only find it. And the mirror had given it to him. Quirrell tried to take it. When his hands closed on Harry's arms, the pain was immediate and total, a burning that came from the inside, from the skin itself. Harry heard Quirrell's cry and thought, stupidly, "I'm hurting him." He held on. He pressed his hands to Quirrell's face, because it was the only thing he could think to do, and the burning went outward, and Quirrell screamed. And then the screaming stopped. There was a moment of pressure, something passing through him that had no weight, but was nevertheless enormous, cold and vast, and not quite nothing. And then it was gone, and Quirrell was on the floor, and Harry was still standing, and the stone was still in his pocket. And then everything went dark. He woke in the hospital wing. He knew it before he fully knew anything else. The smell of it, the particular quality of the silence, the light coming through the high windows at an angle that meant it was afternoon. He was in the bed nearest the window. He lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling. The chair beside the bed was empty. He looked at it for long enough to understand what he was feeling, which was not quite surprise, but was something in that family. He had known, somewhere below the level of fully knowing it, that the chair would be empty. Dumbledore was not here. Dumbledore had not been here since March. The chair was empty, and the light came through the high windows, and the ward was quiet, and he lay in the bed and did not have a name for what he felt about the empty chair, which was not grief and was not relief, and was somewhere in the space between the two where things lived that you hadn't finished understanding yet. The door opened. He heard the precise, deliberate footsteps before he saw her. McGonagall came to the chair and sat down in it. She did not say, "How are you feeling?" which was what adults usually said. She said nothing for a moment. She looked at him with the expression he had come to recognize over the past 7 months, the one that meant she was taking him seriously and expected him to take himself seriously in return. She said, "The stone is safe. Quirrell is dead. You did what needed to be done." He said, "Voldemort was in him. I felt him. Leave." He stopped. Is he gone?" "Not gone," she said. "Scattered. He will not return quickly. The stone will be destroyed." She paused. "This is good news." He thought about it. He supposed it was. She said, "What you did in that room was brave." He said, "I was scared the whole time." She looked at him. "Those are the same thing, Potter," she said. "Bravery is not the absence of fear. It is acting despite it. You already know this. You have known it longer than most people do." He didn't answer. He thought about the underground chamber and Quirrell's hands, and the pain and the thing that had passed through him that had no weight. And he thought about the chair, the empty chair that had been someone else's, that was hers now, that she sat in without anything that looked like comfort, but with something that was better than comfort, which was the particular attention of a person who intended to remain. He looked at the ceiling and felt, for no reason he could entirely account for, the thing he had been feeling since November slowly arrange itself into a slightly more manageable shape. Not resolved, just a little less impossible to hold. She stayed until the lamp at the far end of the ward lit itself, quietly and without announcement. She did not fill the silence. When she left, she said, "Rest." Not a suggestion. He slept, and the castle held him the way it held everything it tended to, reliably and without ceremony, through the night. The end of term came in the slow, accumulated way that end of terms came. Not with any single moment, but with the particular winding down of a year that felt, to Harry, like letting out a breath he had been holding since November. Examinations were sat. Marks were given. Trunks were packed. The castle began to release its students one by one in the way it always did at this time of year, opening its hands and sending them back to whatever awaited them. What awaited Harry was different this year. Privet Drive would remain his legal anchor. He would return there at least once a year, briefly, able to call it home, the charm's thread of connection not yet severed. But the door he would actually live behind, for the first time, was going to be a different one. The Weasleys had said yes before anyone finished asking. Molly Weasley had written Harry a letter, warm, practical, slightly overwhelming, that said they would need a camp bed in Ron's room, but she was very good at enlargement charms, and he should not worry. She had also mentioned Percy was making a fuss about the bathroom, but Percy made a fuss about everything, and Harry should pay no attention to that. McGonagall said goodbye to the students in the entrance hall, which was where she chose to stand, nothing more ceremonial than it needed to be. She was competent and tired in the way of a person who had been carrying a role they didn't choose. She said the things that needed to be said, did not perform warmth she did not have, and students went away from the conversation with the sense of being genuinely addressed rather than managed. When it was Harry's turn, she looked at him in the way that meant she was taking him seriously, and pressed a small envelope into his hand. "There was a photograph in the school archive," she said. "I thought you might like to have it." The potions grade arrived by owl. Acceptable, the kind of mark that said nothing notable has happened here. He thought about Snape in the hearing room in winter, and Snape alone in his laboratory, with one blue flame. He put the parchment away. Dumbledore was not at the leaving feast. The headmaster's seat was empty. McGonagall sat in the deputy's chair, as she had all year. Harry had walked past the headmaster's office that morning, and the door had been propped open. On the wall beside the other portraits was an empty frame, gilded, the same size and style, plaque already engraved. He had not been able to read it from where he stood, but hadn't needed to. The castle had prepared ahead of itself, the way very old buildings did. It knew what had happened, and what would eventually follow, and it had made the space already. Hagrid was at the station. He stood on the platform with the particular quality of largeness that was Hagrid in public, large in all directions, his enormous hands moving through the crowd of students and trunks and owls and familiars with the careful attention of someone who was perpetually aware of his own size and its effects on the spaces around him. He had not said anything to Harry about Dumbledore all term, which Harry understood was not indifference, but the opposite. The things Hagrid could not say were the things he felt most. He found Harry near the barrier with his trunk and Hedwig, and he looked at Harry for a moment with the expression Harry had last seen in March in the hut over tea, the one that lived underneath the composure. And he said, "You did well, Harry. This year. All of it." Harry said, "You too, Hagrid." Hagrid's face did something complicated. He nodded. He said, "Go on, then. Before you miss it." He was very large and not entirely composed. Harry went through the barrier. Hermione found him before the train left. She was on the platform, not boarding yet, with a piece of parchment in one hand and the particular expression she wore when she had found something she needed to do something with, and the question was only what. She had been reading through the inquiry's legal records all term, the documents that had been made available in the board's formal proceedings, public record now, available in the school library's legal archive if you knew what you were looking for, which Hermione always did. She said, "I found something in the 1981 prosecution records." Harry looked at her. She held up the parchment. "Sirius Black," she said. "McGonagall mentioned him, the Godfather. I looked for his trial record." She paused. "There isn't one. He was sent to Azkaban in November 1981, and there's no trial record. No formal proceedings. Nothing." Harry went still. He thought about McGonagall's office in November, and the particular quality of silence she had produced when he asked about whether there had been anyone else. He thought, there was a Godfather. He is not available. He had understood then that not available was the whole story, and now he understood it was not. Hermione looked at him. "I think McGonagall should see this." McGonagall was still on the platform, seeing students off. She turned when Hermione approached and looked at the parchment Hermione extended to her. She took it. She read it. She read it again. She stood on the platform with the sound of the train and the crowd and the ordinary noise of a school year ending around her, and she looked at the parchment for a very long time without saying anything, and her face had the quality that Harry had come to associate with her in the moments when she was reckoning with something that had been in front of her for longer than she had understood it to be. She folded the parchment. She put it in her robes. She looked at Hermione. She said, "Thank you, Miss Granger." She said it the way she said things that were not small. The train whistle sounded. Harry got on. He found a compartment. Ron fell asleep almost immediately in the way he always did on long journeys, without apparent transition or effort. Harry sat with his robe and his trunk, and Hedwig drowsing on her perch, and he remembered the envelope McGonagall had given him. He opened it on the train, with England moving past the window in the long summer way, green and gold and wide, under a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to do anything with the afternoon. Inside was a photograph. James Potter, 16 years old, on a broomstick on the Gryffindor Quidditch pitch, in his scarlet Quidditch robes with the number on the back and the untidy black hair that never lay flat, and the wide, easy grin of a boy who had never in his life had a reason not to grin. He was waving. The photograph waved. Behind him, the Hogwarts pitch was green and gold, and the sky was the same afternoon. Sky Harry was watching now through the glass. Harry looked at his father for a long time. Then he looked at England, going past. He thought about Madame Pomfrey going to her filing cabinet in November, in the quiet after the Quidditch match, for no reason more dramatic than professional habit. He thought about 2 files on a table in a small sitting room off the hospital wing. He thought about what it had required, the specific sequence of events that had to occur, the specific people who had to make the specific decisions they made, for someone to look at him and see what was actually there. He thought about Hermione on the platform with a piece of parchment, and about McGonagall's face when she read it, and about the particular quality of the way things at Hogwarts kept moving once they had begun to move. Someone had pulled 2 files from a cabinet. Someone had put them side by side and looked, and it had been enough to change everything. Not to fix everything. He understood the difference now, or was beginning to. But to change it, which was the precondition for the fixing, and which was not nothing. It was not nothing. He put the photograph carefully back in the envelope and held it in his lap and watched England go by, and thought about the summer ahead and what the Burrow might look like from the garden in the morning, and found that for the first time in a very long time